In this video, we will look at how the English Civil War impacted on Hampshire and Sussex, with a special attention to Petersfield, Chichester and Arundel and the surrounding rural areas. So, nice to see you, some familiar faces and some of you are new. So, I'm talking to you about the English Civil War. Now, you've just been learning about Saxons and Vikings, that's right, isn't it? So, now they were 1,500, 1,000 years ago, so a long, long time. So that I'm talking to you about a period in history that's about 350 years ago. So, still a long time ago, but not quite as long ago as the Saxons and Vikings. So, Civil War, that's the first question. Now, I think you all know what a war is, unfortunately. There's a lot on the news, isn't there, about the war in the Ukraine. Anyone know what a civil war is? Yes?
Is it like a war between one thing and they're fighting for what they want?
Yeah, but and when you say one thing, I think you're just about right, but what do you mean by one thing?
Like there's a thing, like if, I don't know, wooden flooring should be banned. One person wants it to be banned, one person doesn't, and they're fighting over that one.
That's pretty close to it. I think that's pretty close. Yes?
Is it like where there's one country but they've divided into like two teams?
Yes.
Trying to fight against each other for who wants to be right?
Yeah, perfect. So between the two of you, you've got it spot on. So a civil war is a war in one country where people are fighting over something that means so much to them that they can't talk about it calmly and rationally. They've even gone beyond shouting at each other, and it's got so bad that they're actually fighting each other. So civil wars are very bad wars. You don't want to get involved in civil wars. Perhaps the most famous one is the American Civil War, which happened in the 19th century, and that's quite famous because it's been on TV and it's been part of films. But the English Civil War, you may... Oh, who's heard of the English Civil War? Hands up if you've even heard of it. A couple of you. Okay. So what do you know? What do you know about the English Civil War?
Well, there were Roundheads, which
Yeah.
were the Parliament.
Yeah.
And they didn't like King Charles. But I can't remember.
Well, that's yes.
King Charles threw the Parliament away. He pushed it away like he was the ruler, and then the Parliament didn't want that. And when he went back, because Scotland and then other people were trying to fight him, he went back for money. But then the Parliament said no.
You're very well informed. That's excellent. Yes.
The people who supported the king and wanted him were called the Cavaliers or something like that.
Yeah, they were called Cavaliers. Yes.
He asked the Scotlands to be on his team or something like the Scotlands.
No.
And all they did was hand him to the Parliament and they executed him.
Very impressed. And you haven't done this in class?
A little bit more histories and all that.
No, you've done. That's really good. You're extremely well informed. So, following on from what you've just been saying, here's King Charles I. Now, that's quite interesting, isn't it? Because we've just got a new king, King Charles III. So this was the first King Charles, and he became King of England in 1625. And as you were saying, he believed, this is an important thing to understand, he believed that he was king not by chance or accident or because he was, yes. He was chosen by God. Exactly, yeah. He thought he was chosen by God. And therefore, even if he wanted to, supposing he got bored of being king, I don't want to be king anymore, he couldn't do that because God had chosen him. He had to be king, even if he didn't really want to do it. Now, this was unfortunate in a way because he had that idea and that belief at the very moment that other people in England thought power should be with Parliament. So, what's Parliament? Someone who hasn't answered. Anyone? Lads on the back there, what's Parliament? Any idea what Parliament is? Okay. Have you seen Parliament on television? You have, and when you've seen it on television, what leader stands up in Parliament? Yes, who is what's his job? Prime Minister, excellent. Yes, so today, yes.
Were there any protests against King Charles when he became king?
Not when he became king, but there were murmurings. People were murmuring like, well, not sure we want him as king. So the difference between then and now is that now Parliament really runs the country. We've got the king, King Charles III, and his mother died, Queen Elizabeth, didn't she, this year? So he is king, and he lives in a palace, and he goes around in a lovely state coach, but he hasn't really got any power. The king can't decide to get rid of the government. The king can't decide new laws. Even though they're done in his name, it's really the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. Yes?
Then why do we have Parliament? Why in those days were the kings and the queen and the monarch so powerful, and now they're not?
Well, in a way, that's what it's a brilliant question, and hopefully that's what I'm going to tell you this afternoon, because really, why Parliament is powerful now is because of what happened in the English Civil War. Yes?
If the king and queen don't have any power, why is there king and queen?
Why do we still have them?
Yeah.
Should we come to that at the end? Because I think that's it's a perfectly good question why we still have them. But perhaps at the end of the talk, it will make more sense, the answer to that. So, this was another man who was very powerful at the time. He looks a bit sinister, doesn't he? He doesn't look like the sort of person you'd happily invite into your house for a cup of tea, does he? I don't like the look of this man. And he was the Archbishop of Canterbury. Okay, so and we still have an Archbishop of Canterbury today. So who's the Archbishop? What's the Archbishop's job? Oh, stunned on that one. So the Archbishop is the head. Yes.
I'm just going to have a random guess.
Go on.
People that execute?
No. It's always good to have a guess, but although this man who was Archbishop was executed during the Civil War. So the Archbishop is the head of the church in England. Well, no, actually the king or queen is the head of the church, but he does all the day-to-day running of it. And Welby, what's his first name? Justin Welby. He's the current Archbishop of Canterbury. So he's the most important church person in England. And this man, he was the Archbishop under Charles I. And what he thought that priests and vicars didn't get enough respect. He thought in England, people should be very respectful of priests and vicars, and particularly respectful of him. Yes?
Did he make a protest or a campaign about it?
Well, he didn't really need to, did he? Because he had the power. So people protested against him. And he brought in a new prayer book with new prayers that people didn't like. Now, you might think, of all the things that might make you annoyed or angry, you probably think, I don't think I get very annoyed or angry about a prayer book. But in the 17th century they did. And look, so this is a vicar, a priest in a church, reading from the new prayer book. And look what the people are doing. They're throwing chairs and books at him. They're so angry. We don't want this prayer book. We don't want Archbishop Laud's prayer book. We don't like his religion and we don't like him. And if we don't like him, that implies we don't like the king because it's the king who made him Archbishop. So here's Parliament. It looks a bit different to our Parliament today, but it's the same idea. There were members of Parliament who were elected from all over England. But today, every person aged 18 and over can vote in England, in Britain. Back then, first of all, you had to be a landowner to vote. If you didn't own a lot of land or you didn't own a big property, you couldn't vote. So not everybody could vote, only a few people could vote. And the Parliament, a lot of people in the Parliament didn't like the power of the king and they didn't like the power of the Archbishop, and they thought Parliament should have more power. And the king thought Parliament should have less power. So you can, yes?
Who started it? Did the king say first that Parliament had less, or did the Parliament say first that the king had more?
Yeah, that's hard to answer because in a way it sort of gradually crept up. It didn't suddenly happen. So Charles I's father, James I, also thought he ruled by act of God. Now, before he became King of England, he'd been King of Scotland. And then he became King of Scotland and England when the first Queen Elizabeth died. And there were lots of people in the English Parliament who didn't like someone from Scotland ruling them. They were a bit like, oh, we don't want this man from Scotland telling us what to do. So there was a bit of anger there in James I's reign. It just got worse during Charles I's reign. The argument got stronger, and there were lots of angry scenes in Parliament. And then the king was so fed up with Parliament, and I think you said that, didn't you, about Scotland and the wars with Scotland. And the king said, right, I've run out of money, I need more money. So he said to Parliament, you've got to raise me more taxes from the people to pay for my wars. And Parliament said no. They wouldn't do it. And there were lots of rows, and in the end, the king turned up at Parliament with a load of soldiers to arrest the people in Parliament who were against him. But they'd been warned. Someone who worked for the king had sympathy for Parliament, and he'd warned them. So when the king arrived in Parliament, the people he'd come to arrest had disappeared. And he said, I see the birds have flown. That was his comment, describing them as birds that had flown from the nest. But that's what started the Civil War. Because one thing Parliament said is, Parliament is for the MPs only. Nobody can come into Parliament unless they're a member of Parliament. Not even the king can come in where we are. We won't allow it. So the king marching into Parliament with soldiers, that caused such anger that that's what started the Civil War. Because really, the king was saying, I'm going to use my soldiers to put a stop to Parliament. And Parliament said, okay, we'll have our own army. We'll create our own army. And that's how the war began. So, after 1 year of war, and I'm going to talk about the battles in a minute, and who fought who and who the people were, but after 1 year of war, the orange bit was for Parliament, and the grey bit was for the king. And the reason Scotland and Ireland aren't included is because they got involved in the war later, but at this point, the war was just in England. And can you see where we are? There's the Isle of Wight. And yes.
When he got captured and got put into prison, how long did it take him to be able to get back out?
Who's this?
The king.
We'll come on to. We haven't come on to that yet. Good question. I'll come on to it because he hadn't been captured. So the king was frightened to be in London. The king thought, if I stay in London, all the people in London are for Parliament. I'm not safe. So the king went to Oxford. Do you all know the town of Oxford, where there's a big university? So the king raised his army at Oxford, and Parliament raised their army in London. So this orange area, the south and east of England, that was for Parliament. The north of England, Wales, and the southwest of England was for the king. Yes?
So since it's sort of like split as the orange goes in between two of them, the people in like the middle and the other sides, because they crossed the bit where Parliament was to get to the other bits where the king was.
So the crosses are where there were big battles. That's what the crosses represent. But yes, they'd feel a bit squeezed, wouldn't they, there, because they've got the king's soldiers one side and the other. Yes?
Is there a bit of the king in between the Parliament bit?
Oh, well, this bit here, that must have just been a small area that was really for the king, and Parliament couldn't take it over. And so where London was for the Parliament, the east was for the Parliament, and down here where we are, in Sussex, well, East Sussex, Lewes, do you all know Lewes? Have you been to Lewes? No. Eastbourne, places like that, Hastings, Rye, they were for Parliament, but West Sussex, Chichester, Arundel, was for the king. So if you were living here, just imagine if you were living here 350 years ago, you wouldn't quite know whether you were in a Parliament area or an area for the king. And you might have felt really unsafe because you thought, oh, I'm not quite sure who's going to win here. So someone said earlier about Roundheads and Cavaliers. So the person on the left, he's someone who fought for Parliament. And they were called Roundheads. They certainly, like all of us, they had quite round heads. But there was a reason they were called Roundheads, yes.
Because they had round heads.
They had what?
They had round helmets and they looked like they had a round head.
They did have round helmets. And that may be part of it. That may well be part of it because the person on the right is a cavalier for the king. And he looks quite different, doesn't he, how he's dressed. And what about his hair? Can you see his hair? Yes.
It's like a cavalier's tail.
A cavalier, yes, it does. It looks like a bit like a poodle's tail. So the cavaliers had long hair. The cavalier men had long hair. Whereas the people who fought for Parliament, they didn't just have round helmets, they had short hair. And so the cavaliers, as a joke, to make fun of them, said, oh, look at you, you roundheads. Yes?
So if the Cavaliers, which were the men, if they had long hair, what about the women? Would they have long hair as well?
Yeah, the women had long hair. In fact, at that time, all men and women who were on the cavalier side all looked beautiful. If you see paintings of, they all have beautiful, I mean, this is black and white, but the men had the same beautiful coloured clothes and paid special attention to their hair as much as the women did. Yes?
I've got two questions.
Yes?
The first one is, did only the men fight, or were the women also fighting?
It was mainly the men who fought, yes. But the women did get involved in the Civil War, and I'll talk about how they got involved in a minute. And the other question?
Did they have to agree like rules? Like, did they have to have long hair so that they could see whose side they were on? Like, did they have to talk to each other and like agree?
No. There were no. But it's a good question. It was just their choice. And also, as the war went on, one way. I mean, it's sort of answering your question. One way you could show who you were supporting was how you dressed and how you did your hair. So although it wasn't a rule, you wouldn't really be dressing like that if you were going to fight for Parliament, and you wouldn't really be dressing like that if you were going to fight for the king, because someone could think you were an enemy and attack you. Yes?
What if, like, one round-head woman got married to
A cavalier.
cavalier's man?
Yeah.
What would the mix be? if they both decided?
They'd have to be very much in love, because it would cause such a row, because families were divided. This is very sad. Generally, you had a family, and all the family would be for the king, or you'd have a family, and all the family would be for Parliament. But there were also families where people were divided. And so people who'd got on very well, brothers and sisters, cousins, fathers and sons, the Civil War divided them, and they might have never spoken to each other again. And even worse, they might have even faced each other in battle. So the Civil War didn't just divide the country, it did divide families. War could come to your village. So this is an old drawing, and you can see the soldiers with pikes, and there's a cannon, and that could be Midhurst. And imagine how frightening that was. If you were living in a small village like this 350 years ago, life was very quiet, and not many things happened that you didn't expect to happen. People were working in the fields, people came home, they had their food, it got dark, they went to bed, they got up when it was light, and they went to work in the fields. So life was very predictable, and suddenly, you've got an army coming through the village, men on horses, men with guns, men with swords. That would be a very frightening thing. Perhaps for some people, exciting. Their life was perhaps a bit boring. Oh, this is amazing. What's happening? Maybe I'll go and join an army, get away from the village, have a different life. So the war comes to... Now, you all know Chichester, don't you? Yes.
You know how you said that the women were involved?
Yeah.
Were they involved, like like the same as World War II, having, how they were helping with the land more?
I've got the pictures later on. Can I come back to it? I promise I won't forget, and I will explain, I'll answer that question. They were involved in a different way. So this is Chichester, which you all know Chichester, don't you? You all know Chichester. And the middle of Chichester actually still looks quite like this old map. So this is a map from the time of the Civil War. And you can see that the city was still inside the walls. Now, Chichester is a very, very unusual city in England because a long time ago, every town and city had a big wall round it to keep it safe. And then when we got into less dangerous times, when people were more prosperous and less frightened of war, all these walls were demolished. And there's only a few towns and cities in England left that have walls. And Chichester has one of the best preserved city walls anywhere. You can still imagine what it would have been like. You've been there?
Isn't that wall that's near Goodwood area, that's made out of like chopped stones?
Mm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
No, Chichester.
In fact, the wall was first built by the Romans. And then the Saxons rebuilt it, and then in medieval times they rebuilt it. So, there's Chichester, still got its wall around it. Yeah.
Is it still all the way around it today, or has bits of it broken?
There are some gaps. But it's remarkable how much survives, really.
If they know Priory Park,
Yeah.
the best reference to the wall.
Oh, you all know Priory Park, do you? Yes, well, the wall's very clearly seen in Priory Park. Very clearly seen. So, Chichester, most of the people in Chichester were for Parliament. And there was a man called Henry Chitty, Captain Henry Chitty, and he was the captain of the armed bands. Right? And that was a name given to a militia. And a militia is like a group of soldiers, but they're like part-time soldiers. They're not full-time soldiers. They're soldiers that just train at night time. And he had a key to a big shed full of muskets, which are like old-fashioned rifles, and swords. And Henry Chitty was for Parliament. So all the time Henry Chitty and his men were for Parliament, then Chichester would stay for Parliament. But there were some people in Chichester who were for the king. And they played a trick on Henry Chitty and his men. They said, look, we don't want a row in Chichester. We don't want to start fighting in Chichester, do we? We can settle this by talking. Let's have a big meeting. So they had a meeting, and the Royalists were there, the Cavaliers, and the Roundheads were there, the Parliament people. But some of the Royalists weren't there. Some of the Royalists, and this was at night time, went to the walls and opened the city gates, which they shouldn't have done, and let in a Royalist army under the command of the High Sheriff. So you thought, Sheriff sounds like American, doesn't it? Like cowboys. But there was a High Sheriff of Sussex, and he lived at Uppark, which is a big house, not very far from here. Has the school been to Uppark? No, it's a big old country house. It's still there today. You have?
Yeah, with the family.
Yeah. No. And so he came in and he took Chichester for the king. And this caused a terrible row, you know. And all the people for Parliament in East Sussex go, we can't have this, we can't have Chichester being taken over for the king. So all the people in East Sussex, in Lewes, they raised their own army and they crossed over into East Sussex. And then a parliamentarian general called William Waller came down with another army. It was this time of year. It was in 1642, and it was December. And just like now, it was really cold. And the soldiers were all round the Chichester. And the Royalist army was inside Chichester. And they wouldn't surrender. And they got the wall. And the soldiers outside, they were camping in the cold, and it got colder and colder. So you imagine how unpleasant that would be. You're just waiting. There's no fighting, there's nothing to do, you're just waiting to see what happens. And so General William Waller realised that the land north of the city was higher up. than the land to the other side. So he had cannon put up here on land called the Broyle, and he started to fire cannon into Chichester. Well, you imagine how frightening that would be if you were in the Chichester, in the city, and cannonballs start flying in and exploding. And then someone in Chichester played the same trick that the Royalists had tried. There was a little gate here, and they forced it open, and he let in all the parliamentary soldiers. And when the Royalists realised what was happening, they all ran away out the other gate. So Chichester was taken again for the parliamentarians. And the same thing happened to Arundel. So you all know Arundel? No, you don't know. Well, you're new to the area, aren't you? So Arundel has still got a big castle. So if you ask your parents to take you to Arundel, any of you visited Arundel Castle? Oh, quite a few. Yeah. Now, it looked slightly different than it does today, but it was still a big castle. And again, there were Royalist soldiers. The soldiers in the castle were for the king. But that army from East Sussex I told you about, and General William Waller's army, they came in and they surrounded the castle, and no one could get in and no one could get out of the castle. Yes. They did, yeah. You don't know how they did it, do you? They used cannon. Now, where do you think, if you look carefully at this old picture, you see the castle's high up, isn't it? So, can you see a building outside the castle that's also quite high up? Yeah, what building's that?
Is it the one with the pointy bit?
This bit, yeah, which is a church. So General William Waller got his men up into the tower of the church. They had ropes and they pulled cannon up into the tower and then fired the cannon from the church tower into the castle. Yes.
So if they cannoned the castle, wouldn't the castle do it back?
Yeah, that's a very good question. They didn't do it back, and I think it's because they didn't have any cannon in the castle. Because they hadn't expected to be besieged. The Royalist army thought they were going to take over all of Sussex. And they were waiting for reinforcements. You know what reinforcements? They were waiting for more soldiers with cannon. But the reinforcements couldn't get through because they were at Petersfield. You know, Petersfield, close to here, you know Petersfield? That's where the big Royalist army was, at Petersfield. So a big Royalist army at Petersfield, a small Royalist army in the castle, and quite a big parliamentary Roundhead army in the town. Okay? And then the parliamentary army, the people in the castle hadn't got much food. They ran out of food, so they started eating rats. And then they started eating dogs. I know, but they were desperate, and it was the middle of winter. Yes.
So if you said that they couldn't get out because of all the army surrounding, was it only then a few people that went up the tower to cannon so that they still couldn't get out and escape, so that they weren't killed?
Yeah. So there's only a few people up the tower firing the cannon, but there were soldiers all around. So if anyone had tried to get out, they'd have stopped them. Yeah. I don't know. I would have thought probably about 6, because they weren't huge cannon. 6 or 7 people, big, strong characters, yeah.
Did everyone get killed that was inside the castle?
No, they didn't get killed. They didn't get killed because a lot of them could, it's a big castle with big, thick walls. So even if it was hit by a cannonball, the wall wouldn't collapse because it was such a strong wall. It would be more frightening than anything, just to hear the sound of the explosion. So this map might help, see. So this shows all the different armies that came into West Sussex. Now, there's Cowdray, and there's Petworth House, there's South Harting, and there's Uppark that I mentioned, and so Stedham's about there, isn't it? So you see you're right in the middle here of where all these different armies were marching. And at Petersfield, just off the map, there was Ralph Hopton. And he wanted to come and help the people in Arundel Castle. I'll come back to you in a minute. I'll just tell this story and I'll come back to you. Now, the reason he couldn't come into West Sussex was because there weren't any proper roads. So go out of the school, there's a proper road, isn't there? If you would like the full talk about Sussex and Hampshire in the English Civil War, please contact Chris Hare at the email address below.